Someone may be testing your boundaries right now, not in a loud or obvious way, not through direct confrontation or open conflict, but through small actions that seem harmless at first, actions that feel easy to ignore, easy to excuse, easy to explain away as personality, stress, or misunderstanding. And that's exactly why boundary testing is so difficult to recognize in the beginning. Because if someone openly violated your limits, if they clearly crossed a line without hesitation, you would notice it immediately. You would react. You would protect yourself. But boundary testing rarely begins with obvious violation. It begins with small steps that feel insignificant in isolation but powerful when repeated over time. Think about a moment when you said no to something simple, not a major decision, not a serious conflict, just a small boundary, something that felt natural to express. And instead of that boundary being respected immediately, the response you received felt slightly uncomfortable, not aggressive, not openly disrespectful, but persistent in ways that created tension. Maybe they asked again. Maybe they joked about it. Maybe they acted confused about why you said no. And in that moment, you felt something subtle, hesitation. Not because your boundary was wrong, but because their reaction created uncertainty. And that uncertainty is often where boundary testing begins. Because testing boundaries doesn't always mean crossing them immediately. Sometimes it means observing how you react, how firm you are, how consistent you remain, how willing you are to repeat your limits when pressure appears. And at first, these moments don't feel dangerous. They feel small, unimportant, easy to overlook. You tell yourself it's not a big deal, that maybe you misunderstood, that maybe they didn't realize what they were doing. And those explanations feel reasonable in the beginning. But repeated small violations create patterns that become harder to ignore over time. Because boundaries are not just about rules. They are about protection. Protection of your time, your energy, your emotions, your space. And when those protections begin weakening, even slightly, your sense of stability begins changing in ways that feel subtle but meaningful. You may begin noticing that saying no feels more difficult than before. Not because you changed, but because reactions to your boundaries feel uncomfortable. You begin preparing explanations before expressing limits, thinking about how to phrase your words carefully, wondering how your decision will be received. And that preparation creates hesitation, not because boundaries are wrong, but because reactions feel unpredictable. And unpredictability creates pressure, not loud pressure, not visible pressure, but emotional pressure that makes your decisions feel heavier than they should. And slowly your boundaries begin feeling less natural to express, not because they disappeared, but because maintaining them requires more effort than before, and effort creates fatigue. You begin choosing convenience over clarity, silence over discomfort, agreement over resistance. Not because those choices feel right, but because tension feels exhausting. And that exhaustion becomes one of the earliest signals that boundaries are being tested. Because healthy boundaries create clarity, and they create respect. They create predictability. But when boundaries are repeatedly tested, clarity becomes uncertain, respect becomes inconsistent, predictability becomes unstable, and instability creates emotional discomfort that builds slowly over time. You begin noticing small shifts in how you respond to requests. You hesitate before answering. You delay responses. You soften your refusal. You add explanations where simple answers once felt enough. And that shift may feel polite at first, responsible, considerate. But over time it becomes something heavier. because every extra explanation weakens the strength of your original boundary, not immediately, but gradually. And this gradual weakening is what makes boundary testing so effective. Not because someone forces you to change, but because repeated pressure makes resistance feel uncomfortable. And once resistance feels uncomfortable, compliance feels easier, not correct, not empowering, but easier. And ease becomes the reason boundaries begin fading. Not because you stop caring, but because maintaining them feels emotionally draining. And this is where many people begin doubting their own limits, wondering if they are too strict, too sensitive, too protective. And that doubt creates vulnerability, because when you begin questioning your own boundaries, consistency becomes difficult to maintain. You hesitate, you reconsider, you adjust, not because your boundaries were wrong, but because reactions made them feel inconvenient. And once inconvenience becomes the focus, protection becomes secondary. You begin prioritizing harmony over clarity, comfort over honesty, peace over protection. And slowly your boundaries begin shrinking, not visibly, not dramatically, but quietly, gradually, in ways that feel harmless at first but become powerful over time. So before we move into the specific signs that reveal when someone is testing your boundaries, there's something important to understand. Boundary testing rarely begins with disrespect. It begins with repetition, with small actions that measure your reaction, your consistency, and your willingness to defend what matters to you. And once repetition begins, patterns begin forming. And once patterns form, awareness becomes necessary, because the moment you begin noticing repeated pressure, repeated hesitation, repeated discomfort around your limits, that's often the moment boundary testing has already begun. And this is where the signs begin to appear more clearly, not all at once, not in ways that feel dramatic, but in repeated behaviors that slowly reveal intention. Patterns that show how someone reacts when limits are placed in front of them. The first sign often begins with something very small. They ignore small limits first, not the big ones, not the obvious ones. The small ones that feel easy to dismiss. You mention something simple, something that matters to you but doesn't feel serious enough to defend strongly, like needing time alone, like wanting space to finish something, like preferring not to discuss certain topics, and instead of respecting that immediately, they continue anyway. Not aggressively, not openly, but casually, as if they didn't fully hear you, as if your words didn't carry weight. They interrupt when you ask not to be interrupted. They bring up topics you said made you uncomfortable. They repeat small behaviors that you quietly ask them to stop. And at first it feels harmless. It feels forgettable. You tell yourself it's not worth making an issue out of something so small. But small limits are often the first ones tested because they reveal how consistent you are with protecting yourself. And if those small limits are ignored without consequence, the next boundary becomes easier to test. Another sign begins appearing when pressure continues, even after you clearly say no. Not immediately aggressive pressure, but repeated attempts. You say no once, they ask again. You repeat your decision. They suggest alternatives. You hold your position. They reframe the request. And what once felt like a simple answer slowly turns into negotiation. Not because you offered negotiation, but because persistence creates emotional discomfort. You begin feeling tension not from your decision, but from the repeated pressure surrounding it. And over time, saying no begins to feel exhausting, not because no is wrong, but because defending it requires more effort than expected. And that effort slowly changes how often you say it. You begin avoiding refusal altogether, not because you agree, but because resistance feels tiring. Another sign becomes visible when they act confused about your boundaries, even when you explain them clearly. Not confused once, but repeatedly. You explain something important, a limit, a preference, a personal line that matters to you, and their response feels unclear. They ask questions that suggest they didn't fully understand, even when your words were direct, even when your explanation was simple. They say things like they didn't realize, that they forgot, that they misunderstood. And sometimes that confusion feels believable. But when confusion repeats after clarity, something deeper may be happening. Because repeated confusion weakens consistency. It forces you to explain yourself again, and again, and again. And over time, repeated explanation becomes exhausting. Not because your boundary is complicated, but because maintaining clarity requires effort that shouldn't be necessary. Another sign begins to appear when guilt becomes part of your decision-making. Not obvious guilt, not accusations, but emotional responses that make you feel responsible for disappointing someone. You say no, they sigh. You set a boundary, they withdraw emotionally. You choose your own needs, they become distant. And suddenly your decision feels heavier than it should, not because it was wrong, but because their reaction created emotional discomfort. And guilt becomes something you carry even when your boundary was reasonable. You begin questioning whether your needs are too strict, too inconvenient, too demanding. And slowly, guilt becomes a tool that weakens your willingness to maintain limits. Another sign appears when reactions to your boundaries feel unpredictable. Sometimes they respect your limits. Other times they challenge them. Sometimes they respond calmly. Other times they react emotionally. And this inconsistency creates uncertainty because you never fully know how your boundary will be received. You hesitate before expressing it. You calculate timing. You measure tone. You consider consequences. Not because boundaries are wrong, but because unpredictability creates tension that feels difficult to manage. And that tension makes your limits feel risky to express. Another sign becomes visible when you notice repeated testing of your reactions, not just your limits. Your reactions. They observe how you respond to pressure, how long you remain firm, how quickly you adjust, how willing you are to repeat your position. And those observations shape future behavior. If resistance weakens, pressure increases. If hesitation appears, persistence continues. And slowly the situation becomes less about the boundary itself and more about how much pressure you tolerate. And once tolerance becomes visible, repetition becomes predictable. Another sign begins appearing when emotional reactions intensify the moment you hold your ground. You remain calm, firm, clear. And instead of resolution, emotion increases, not always anger. Sometimes disappointment, sometimes sadness, sometimes frustration. And those reactions create emotional tension that makes standing firm feel uncomfortable. Not because your boundary is wrong, but because emotional responses feel heavy to carry. You begin wondering if holding your ground is worth the discomfort, if resistance is worth the tension. And slowly, maintaining your boundary begins feeling emotionally expensive. And that emotional cost becomes the reason many people begin adjusting their limits, not because they changed their mind, but because pressure became difficult to hold. And when all of these signs begin connecting, when small limits are ignored, when no becomes negotiation, when confusion repeats, when guilt appears, when reactions feel unpredictable, when pressure continues, and when emotional responses increase the moment you remain firm, something becomes clear. Boundaries are not simply being crossed, they are being tested, measured, observed, repeated. not randomly, but intentionally or habitually in ways that reveal how much resistance exists. And once resistance weakens, testing becomes easier, because consistency is what protects boundaries, and inconsistency is what weakens them. And when patterns become visible, when repeated pressure becomes noticeable, when hesitation becomes familiar, awareness begins forming in ways that cannot be ignored. Not dramatic awareness, not loud realization, but quiet understanding that something about these interactions feels heavier than it should. And that awareness becomes the beginning of protection. Because once patterns are seen clearly, responses begin changing naturally, not through force, but through clarity. And clarity becomes the first step towards strengthening boundaries that once felt uncertain. And this is where awareness begins to change the way you see those situations. Not suddenly, not in a dramatic realization, but in small moments of clarity that appear quietly, almost unexpectedly. Because once you begin noticing patterns of boundary testing, even slightly, the way you interpret behavior begins to shift. You begin remembering moments that once felt small, but now feel meaningful. Moments where you hesitated before repeating your limit. Moments where you softened your response to avoid tension. Moments where you agreed to something you didn't truly want, not because you changed your mind, but because the pressure surrounding your decision felt heavier than expected. And slowly those memories begin connecting, not randomly, but in patterns that reveal how often your limits were questioned instead of respected. Because boundary testing rarely feels obvious while it's happening. It feels subtle. It feels manageable. It feels temporary. But repetition changes everything. Repeated pressure changes perception. Repeated discomfort changes confidence. Repeated hesitation changes behavior. And once repetition becomes visible, something inside you begins shifting. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. You begin noticing how often your decisions were influenced by reactions rather than intention. How often your responses were shaped by discomfort rather than clarity. How often your silence replaced honesty because tension felt easier to avoid than conflict. And that realization can feel uncomfortable at first. Not because something terrible happened, but because awareness changes how you understand your own behavior. You begin questioning why certain limits felt difficult to maintain, why simple no responses turned into explanations, why small requests felt heavier than they should have. And those questions begin leading to something important: understanding that boundaries are not just words. They are actions. They are repetition. They are consistency over time. Because saying no once is not always enough. Maintaining no requires clarity. Maintaining no requires repetition. Maintaining no requires confidence that your limit matters even when someone else reacts emotionally. And this is where many people feel something unexpected: fear of tension. Not fear of conflict, but fear of discomfort. Because tension feels emotionally heavy. Silence feels uncomfortable. Reactions feel unpredictable. And that unpredictability makes boundaries feel risky to express. But here's the truth that changes everything. Discomfort doesn't always mean danger. Sometimes discomfort means resistance. Sometimes discomfort means pressure being tested. Sometimes discomfort means your boundary is being challenged in ways that reveal how strong it truly is. And once you understand that discomfort is part of protection, not a sign of weakness, your relationship with tension begins changing. You begin seeing tension not as something to avoid, but as something to observe. You begin noticing reactions without immediately adjusting your response. You begin allowing discomfort to exist without rushing to fix it. And that shift creates something powerful: emotional stability. Not because reactions disappear, not because pressure stops instantly, but because your response becomes clearer, more consistent, more intentional. You begin pausing before explaining yourself, not defensively, but thoughtfully. You begin responding without over-justifying your decisions, not aggressively, but calmly. You begin repeating your boundary when necessary, not emotionally, but confidently. And repetition becomes one of the strongest tools for protecting limits. Because boundaries are not proven once, they are reinforced repeatedly. And repetition creates clarity, not just for others, but for yourself. Because each time you repeat your boundary, your confidence strengthens. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly through consistency. And consistency creates predictability. Not predictability of reactions, but predictability of your own behavior. You begin trusting yourself to respond the same way each time your limit is tested. You begin trusting your voice to remain steady even when pressure appears. You begin trusting your decision even when someone reacts emotionally. And that trust becomes the foundation of strong boundaries, not control over others, but control over your own responses. And this shift changes how interactions feel over time. Not immediately, not perfectly, but noticeably. You feel less hesitation before saying no, less anxiety before expressing limits, less guilt after maintaining boundaries. And that reduction in hesitation creates clarity, not confusion, not doubt. Clarity. Because once clarity replaces hesitation, your limits feel natural again. Not forced, not defensive, but grounded in understanding. And understanding changes behavior without requiring force. You begin choosing responses that reflect your needs rather than someone else's reactions. You begin protecting time without apology, energy without explanation, space without hesitation. And these small decisions create noticeable change inside you, not just in behavior, but in confidence. Because confidence doesn't come from approval. It comes from consistency, from knowing that your limits remain stable, even when pressure appears. And perhaps the most important shift happens when you stop measuring your boundaries by other people's reactions. You stop adjusting limits based on guilt. You stop weakening decisions based on discomfort. You stop shrinking your needs to maintain temporary peace, and instead you begin measuring your boundaries by one simple question. Does this protect what matters to me? Not what feels convenient, not what feels comfortable, but what feels necessary. Because boundaries are not about controlling others. They are about protecting yourself, protecting time, protecting energy, protecting emotional space. And once protection becomes intentional instead of reactive, something stabilizes inside you. You feel calmer, more certain, less reactive to pressure. Not because challenges disappear, but because your response becomes stronger, more predictable, more reliable. And reliability changes how others interact with you over time. Not because you force them to change, but because consistency creates expectations. Expectations that your limits remain steady, that your response remains clear, that your decisions remain consistent. And this clarity reduces repeated testing, not completely, but noticeably, because boundaries that remain firm become harder to challenge, and boundaries that remain unclear become easier to test. And understanding that difference becomes one of the strongest forms of protection you can develop. Because once awareness becomes part of how you respond to pressure, boundary testing becomes easier to recognize before it escalates, before hesitation turns into agreement, before discomfort turns into silence, before pressure turns into compliance. And that early recognition changes everything, not through confrontation, not through argument, but through clarity. through repetition, through confidence built slowly over time. And this confidence doesn't feel loud. It feels calm, steady, grounded, because it comes from knowing that your limits matter even when they create discomfort, even when they create tension, even when they require repetition. And once that understanding becomes part of how you think, how you react, how you respond, something changes in a way that becomes difficult to reverse. You stop reacting automatically. You start responding intentionally. You stop shrinking your limits. You start strengthening them. And that shift creates emotional stability that becomes difficult to influence. So if any part of these patterns felt familiar, even slightly, don't ignore that recognition. Don't dismiss it. Don't convince yourself that discomfort means you are too strict or too sensitive, because sometimes discomfort is the clearest signal that protection is necessary. And once you begin noticing those signals, once you begin recognizing repeated pressure instead of isolated moments, once you begin trusting your limits again, something changes in ways that feel subtle but powerful. You begin speaking more clearly, responding more confidently, standing more firmly in your own decisions. And when clarity replaces hesitation, when repetition replaces doubt, when consistency replaces pressure, boundary testing begins losing its power, because testing only works when limits feel uncertain. But the moment limits become clear, the moment responses remain steady, the moment hesitation turns into confidence, that's the moment pressure begins fading. And once your boundaries feel stronger than the discomfort surrounding them, no one can quietly test them without you noticing again.